Thank you so much for being here for the start of our webinar series on snow drought and how you can be preparing your communities. My name is Kyle Bocinsky. I'm the Director of Climate Extension for the Montana Climate Office and a co-PI on the Native Resilience Project, which is a project that focuses on agriculture across the West and strengthening the role of the climate hubs in Indian country. There's three different components to this project. A focus on agriculture, which showcases food sovereignty initiatives, agroecosystem restoration, drought-resistant cropping, and other native resilient successes. A focus on climate data, which we'll be focused on today, that builds approaches to join traditional ecological knowledge with Western data and models of environmental risks and impacts. And then a focus on education, which is really working with the next generation, with K through 12 students, and advancing the ways that educators conduct place-based learning to support resilience at local and regional levels. Everything that I share with you today is available on the Native Resilience website, which is at native-resilience.com, and many other resources. So this presentation, the slides for it will get posted up there. We're also recording this presentation, and it'll be posted on our YouTube channel and linked on nativeresilience.com. So if you know of anybody who missed this presentation, but you think the information is useful, please send them to that. As I said, this is the first in a 4-webinar series that's focused on preparing for snow drought and water stress in tribal agriculture across the West. We're going to cover snow drought, what it is, and what it means for your operation or for folks in your community. We'll bring in experts from the USDA, FEMA, and other native-led assistance programs to talk about what you can do to prepare for drought and to buffer some of the risk. We'll have a panel that shares experiences, tribal experiences for navigating drought and disaster declarations. And we'll offer direct connections to producers and experts that are experiencing this along with you. You're not in this alone. You all are here, so you've registered for this webinar today on February 17th. The next webinar will be on March 17th, and we are asking that you register for each webinar. So this link will bring you to the new webinar registration next time you try to go to it to register for March 17th. That just lets us know who's going to be here and helps us get it on your calendar. So without further ado, I'm going to dive into the main part of today, which is really talking about the current conditions across the Western US, what we're looking at right now in terms of drought, what snow drought is looking like across the West, and then where we can expect to be going as we move into the spring and early summer months. But I like to start these off with just the key takeaways. So if you've got to leave in 2 minutes, this is what I'm going to be talking about. That extreme snow drought is the status in the Western US. We had an abnormally warm and dry winter so far that has kept snowpack levels low across the northern and southern Rocky Mountains. And what that portends is hydrological impacts that will lag into the summer. Areas of extreme drought conditions do persist across the West. Portions of the Central Rockies, Northern Great Plains, and Southern Plains are experiencing extreme drought, according to the U.S. Drought Monitor. We're seeing a shift towards El Nino ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation neutral conditions that are likely to emerge as we move into 2026. And then the potential for El Nino conditions probably by the late summer. And then our outlook for the near term is that we're going to continue to see warm and dry conditions across the southern U.S. and cool and wet conditions across the northern tier of the Rockies. Probably maybe ameliorating some of our snow drought impacts up here in the northern Rockies, but we'll see. So I wanted to start with the US Drought Monitor, a product that's produced by the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. This is the latest US Drought Monitor map. A new one will be released on Thursday that is effective today. So this is from last week. But here's what I was talking about. What we're seeing is that we've got drought conditions all across the West, and especially extreme drought conditions. Those are those D3 level droughts here in the Northern Rockies and going out into the high plains. They call this the Golden Triangle of Montana. Some exceptional drought conditions across the Central Rockies in Colorado, extreme and exceptional drought. Really, what you're seeing here is the impact of the current incredibly low snowpack conditions and warm temperatures that we've seen across this region, combined with some wind effects that may be reducing soil moisture. And then across the Southern Rockies in western New Mexico and portions of eastern Arizona, really that Chusca Range and the Navajo Nation, we're seeing severe drought and extreme drought conditions across that region. Something that I also want to draw your attention to is Texas and the Southern Plains are seeing really dry conditions right now, including some exceptional drought conditions across the western flanks and then down into southern Texas. You know, this product is actually created on a weekly basis by the National Drought Mitigation Center and has been produced since January 4th, 2000. What we're seeing is the last 25 years, or 26 years, excuse me, of the US Drought Monitor flying by in your screen. And what I want you to take away from this is not where any of the given blobs are, but just that since the start of the US Drought Monitor, a portion of the United States has been in drought consistently since January 4th, 2000. Drought is, of course, a common occurrence across the West and across the United States, and something that our producers are always having to deal with. But the flavor of drought, the type of drought that occurs, can be different from time to time. And what we're going to talk about today is some of the lingering impacts that occur when you have snow drought or a lower than average snowpack in our upland areas that leads to hydrological impacts that literally trickle downhill and through time to lower areas that depend on that water for drinking, for municipal use, and of course for agriculture and other consumptive use. What we can see here as we move into 2025 and 2026 is the development of those current conditions that we have today. So let's break this down a little bit. I want to just look at this through time, and I'm going to look at it across these major basins. Now we're shifting to the western US, Alaska, and Hawaii, and we're going to look at the Pacific Northwest, the Missouri, across the southern tier of the Rockies, California Great Basin, Colorado, and Southern Plains, and then Alaska and Hawaii. And this is what you're looking at since 2020. So this is just the last 6 years of drought. As it's sort of burst on the scene during 2021, 2022, we had some really exceptional drought conditions across much of the western U.S. We had a reemergence of some exceptional drought in the Southern Plains and the Colorado Plateau during 2025. And then as we're coming into 2026, what we're seeing is an expansion of drought conditions in the Southern Plains, especially right now. And if we look at the sort of longer history, this is that full history of the US Drought Monitor across each of those basins. So we're looking from January 4th, 2000, all the way to today. What we see is that the Southern Plains are often a leading indicator of drought conditions. And there are all sorts of reasons why this occurs, but as a leading indicator of drought conditions for the rest of these basins. We see drought emerge on the Southern Plains, and then often within 3-6 months, a year, we see that sort of trickle to the west and northwards across the Colorado and California Great Basin, the Missouri River Basin, and the Pacific Northwest. And we've seen that sort of, if you just look, you can see a diagonal pattern here going from the southern plains. We'll get into some of the reasons why this might be towards the end of my talk when we talk about the El Nino Southern Oscillation. But what I want you to take away from this right now is just that when we see drought emerging on the southern plains, for me and those of us who live in the Colorado Basin, California, and the Missouri River Basin, that's when I start really paying attention and planning for drought conditions in the future. So that's our current status. How did we get here? This comes from Climate Toolbox, which is a tool that's developed out of the University of California, Merced. It's a really great tool called Climate Mapper, and I recommend you all check it out. The Climate Toolbox is showing us the mean daily temperature anomaly over the last 90 days. Now, there's a bit of a lag on this, just a couple day lag on this product. This product that I'm showing here is called GridMet, which is a gridded meteorological data set across the US. So this is just looking at through the winter over the last 90 days from mid-November to mid-February, what we've seen across the West. And this won't be surprising to any of you who live out West here with me. We've seen historically warm temperatures on average. And this is the average daily temperature anomaly. We're looking at 5 degrees above normal across most of the Western US. Of course, a lot of the story over the last several weeks has been the anomalously cold temperatures that we've seen across the Eastern US. They're not who I'm talking to today, but what we're seeing is some impacts on snow in the Eastern US. But the West, we've seen really warm temperatures over the last 90 days. And we've seen relatively dry conditions across many portions of the West, including the Central Rockies and the Great Basin over the last 90 days. We've seen precipitation that has been between the 10th and 70th percentile, so fairly low precipitation across much of this region over the last 90 days. And that's continued, or that sort of equates into a measure that we like to think about when we're looking at drought, which is the Standardized Precipitation and Evaporation Index. What SPEI measures is the evaporative demand of the atmosphere. And usually we wouldn't expect there to be a lot of evaporative demand during the wintertime, right? It's cold, so you don't have that heat that's causing evaporation. It's darker. We generally don't have plants doing a lot of growing in the winter. But we've seen, because of these warmer temperatures and because of some of the drier conditions, pretty enhanced SPEI across, especially the southern tier of the Western US over the last 90 days. If we look at this just over the last 30 days, much of those patterns continue, with the exception of down in Texas, where they were affected by that strong cold storm that came across from Texas. My sister who lives in San Antonio, they had really cold temperatures there all the way up through Tennessee, causing big impacts and snow in places like Memphis. But here in the Western US, across the Rockies, the Great Basin, California, and most of the Pacific Northwest, we've continued to see anomalously warm temperatures and anomalously dry conditions. Our precipitation anomaly over the last 30 days, we see most of the Western US in that 10 to 30% of the 1991 to 2020 average. It's just real dry. And those things again lead to an SPEI that's really, really high. So what does that mean for snow? These little dots here are all of what are called the SNOTEL stations, snow telemetry. This is a network run by the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service of weather stations and snow monitoring stations that in real time are measuring our snowpack. They exist at high elevations generally, and are measuring everything from temperature, precipitation, the depth of snow, and critically, snow water equivalent, which is the amount of water that's contained within the snowpack. You can think of it as if you were to take a big cube of snow and you were to melt it down into liquid water. How much water would be in that snowpack where those stations are? So what we see here is the percent of the 1991 to 2020 median. So similar to an average, except it's the central tendency. Half of the years from 1991 to 2020 had more SWE than 50%. Half of them had less SWE. And so what we're seeing here is that if we're in the green areas, those are 100%. This is your average snowpack being experienced. If you're down in the red zones, those are where you've got 50%, half or less of your median snowpack. And if you're up in the blues, you're up in 110. You're more than your average snowpack or your normal snowpack. What we do with these data and what the NRCS does is they're able to aggregate these into hydrologic areas. They're literally just taking averages of those snow telemetry stations over various basins. These are the HUC 8 subbasins. HUC is a hydrologic unit code. This is from the USGS's watershed boundary data set. This is just showing us watersheds and in the percent of normal snowpack, percent of median snowpack that we're seeing in each of those watersheds. And here we can start getting a better picture of what our high elevation snowpack is looking like, and it's not looking good. What we see is that across the Cascade Range, down into the Sierras, in the Great Basin, and in the central and southern Rockies, we're seeing really low snowpack in the 40 percentile down into the single digit percent of snowpack across the Mogollon Rim down in Arizona. So we're seeing really low snowpack across all of these hydrologic basins right here in the middle of February. In the northern Rockies, what those SNOTEL stations show is about average snowpack. Up here in Montana, for example, we're getting readings in the 98, 90th, 91st percent of normal. So that's about normal. We can also aggregate these at higher spatial scales. Once again, these are pulled from all of the SNOTEL stations that are within these boundaries. These are basins at the HUC 6 level, gives us sort of a more coarse view of what snowpack is looking like across the region. We can go even larger to subregions. And then finally, we can look at those really large basins like the Missouri River Basin, the Columbia River Basin in the Pacific Northwest, and the upper and lower upper and lower Colorado River basins. And what we see when we aggregate, again, just across those SNOTEL sites, is that the SNOTEL sites, those high elevation snow monitoring stations across the Missouri River Basin is looking to be about 77% of normal. Across the Columbia River Basin, 58% of normal, and then 60% of normal across the upper Colorado, 53 across the Great Basin, and then lower across Colorado, the Southern Rockies, and this is the Rio Grande drainage. One of the challenges, though, when we're looking at just the SNOTEL stations is that those are high elevation stations. This is data where we're taking a different model for snow, and I'll show it to you in a second. But when we look at the snowpack, which we're in purple here, we're seeing, or in maroon, because I'm at the University of Montana, we're seeing the 2026 snowpack as it's distributed across all of the elevations in that whole Missouri River region. Again, we're looking at this region here. What we're seeing is that, when we're at the upper elevations where a lot of those snowtel stations are, we're pretty close to normal. We're ranging between 50% at the worst, but there's very little elevation or very few stations and very little area of land way up there, to near normal, near 100% of the median across that upper tier. So it looks good. The problem is that a lot of land is not where those snowtel stations are measuring. And yet, during this time of year, and that's what this 2003 to 2025, this is showing you that median snowpack, the snowpack that we might expect. What we see is that we often expect a lot of snow across the high plains, and a lot of water contained in that snow across the high plains at this time of year. That's in gray. But in red here, what we see is that we don't have very much. We're down in the 0 to 10% range across a huge swath of the Missouri River Basin. So there's a different way to look at these snow data, and that's this product. This is a product out of NOAA called SNODAS, the Snow Data Assimilation System. It's taking data from those snowtel sites for the high elevations, but also remotely sensed data from satellites and other data forms to create a gridded representation of snowpack, of that snow water equivalent across the United States. It actually covers the entire United States. I've grayed out areas that have no snow and normally have no snow on this map. But what we're seeing is where there is snow and where there usually is snow represented on here. And then what I've done is I've capped this at 200% of normal. These areas are actually way above normal. I mean, it's 600, 700% of normal, way more snow than they normally have. But I've kept it at 200% for this representation. And what we see is we've got many areas across the Southern Rockies, across the southern tier of the Rocky Mountains are really in this extremely low percentile, including all of the low areas. So this is showing us for that Missouri River Basin, all those low areas that normally would have snow at this time of year, but currently are sitting around 0% of normal because there is no snow on the ground. They're sitting at the lowest possibility for their snowpack. But that's a lot of land area, and so therefore a lot of potential snow. We can also translate this into those same, a similar way of classifying as those USDM drought classes. So I've moved from percents to percentiles. This is looking at over the last, since 2003, over the last 22 years, the percentile that's being experienced. And what this means is that people across this region are experiencing effectively a 1 in 50 or year or worse event. They're effectively experiencing some of the lowest snowpack on record when you're in those deep red regions. And that if we were basing the U.S. Drought Monitor entirely off snowpack, these areas would be in D4 in that exceptional drought class. What we see across the Wyoming Rockies and then up into the Northern Rockies here in Montana is a real mixed bag of snowpack, where we've got some areas, especially down in our lower elevation valleys, where we would normally have snow at this time of year, we've got no snowpack. So we're also experiencing percentiles down in that 0 to 2% percentile range. But our high elevation areas, those tallest peaks, are actually at normal or well above normal, sometimes experiencing some of the most snowpack on record. Down in the Southern Rockies It's not looking good. All of the Southern Rockies, especially the Colorado Rockies here on the Colorado Plateau, are in those lower percentiles between the 0th percentile and the 20th percentile, and those are areas where we're seeing a lot of drought conditions. We can do this same sort of aggregation that the NRCS does for SNOTEL stations across this SNODAS data set. So I just want to flip through that. This is again aggregating that same snow data, the gridded snow data that I'm showing you here, now across those HUC 8 sub basins. And what we're seeing is again really exceptionally low snowpack across the southern Missouri River Basin. We're seeing a lot of snow impacts across the Colorado River Basin, close to normal across the Northern Rockies, and then a mixed bag across the rest of the West, where portions of say the California basins, this is coming off of the Sierras, are near normal, the upper Sierras, but much of the lowlands, because of those warmer than normal temperatures, are seeing less snowpack than normal for this time of year. We can also aggregate at those larger areas, HUC 6, the basin level, the subregion level, and then finally, we're looking here at the representation of that distributed snowpack, that gridded snowpack model across our HUC 2 regions, where we see that the Missouri River Basin is now in that 2 to 5th percentile, that in U.S. drought monitor terms would be extreme drought, snow drought here in the Missouri River Basin, extreme snow drought in the upper Colorado Basin, in the Great Basin, severe snow drought in the southern Colorado Basin, and extreme snow drought in the Rio Grande region. We can also look at this in a slightly different way. This is just looking at the accumulation of snow and of snowpack, of that snow water equivalent. Again, this is using that gridded product, the accumulation of that snow as this season has gone on. This is from September to yesterday, right? And what we're seeing is that in the Pacific Northwest region, so this is that northwestern corner, what we're seeing is that our snowpack was right about normal and maybe a little below through the beginning of the year. Once we hit January, it was at normal, but then the spigots turned off, and what we saw was no snow accumulation. A little bit of melt, but no snow accumulation through most of January. And then we've had a recent storm that has given us a little bit of a burst. What we're showing, this black line, is this year. The colors in the background are since 2003. So they're a representation, again, in those U.S. Drought Monitor classifications of the empirical data of those histories every year since 2000. Since the winter of 2003, 2004, and where we stand in relation to that. If we're in this white area in the middle, we're in the middle 40th percentile, and then this black line, the thin black line, is the median. So you can think of that as average or normal snowpack. So right now, across this entire Pacific Northwest region, we're at about 74% of normal. I've also done something else here, where I've taken it's nothing fancy, but I've created a likely range in the most likely estimate of future conditions. This is nothing fancy. It's entirely based on these 2003 to 2025 conditions, and historically how snowpack has accumulated across the entire Pacific Northwest region every day. So it's just saying, take that history, and if that history were to run forward from now, if we were to have a normal year from now on, what would the snowpack look like? And where would we end up? And when I say end up, what would our peak snowpack be? based on that historical precedent, and that might not be, we might not emulate exactly what median looks like this year, but if we did, we would end up in this dry range of D0 in U.S. drought monitor terms, but we would end up well below normal for our snowpack at our peak, and then it would and then melt off would continue into June. We can look at this across each of those major regions across the West, and I want to. The Missouri River region is looking really bad. We had the same sort of pattern where we had some good snow accumulation towards the beginning of the year, but we had some really wet, warm storms that took out a lot of our snowpack, and we've had dismal conditions since before the beginning of the year, since December. We are currently sitting across the entire Missouri River region at 42% of normal. And my little statistical hack suggests that we're actually at about the maximum that we should be expecting for this year. So we're looking at a year where the amount of snow that we have in our snowpack is maybe at its peak right now. Okay, and is about half of what we normally have for this time of year, a little less than half. So the Missouri River region, this matters for our irrigators in the Missouri River region. It matters for our dam operators and hydroelectric and all the rest. The Upper Colorado River region is seeing historically low conditions. We are currently at 45% of normal, but 45% of normal is lower than we've seen since 2003. So since SNODAS, the snow data assimilation system, started being produced, we're currently at the lowest snowpack in that record. So since 2003. And what we're anticipating in using this simple statistical model of potential accumulations is that our maximum snowpack for the Upper Colorado River region is going to, the most likely would be peaking out at the lowest on record since 2003. So the lowest in the last 22 years. So a real dry year across the Colorado River Basin, where most of that snow storage is. The Rio Grande region is not looking much better. So that's just over the divide from the southern Colorado region. The headwaters are down just west of, or just east, excuse me, of Pagosa Springs in Colorado. If you're wondering where the Rio Grande region starts, it's just up there near Wolf Point Pass. And what we see is we're currently in that D2 to D3 range. But again, the simple statistical model suggests that we're actually near that peak SWE across the Rio Grande region. And we shouldn't expect much more SWE accumulation averaged across the region. And therefore have lower flows and hydrological impacts downstream. For the Great Basin region, the story remains the same. We've got 34% of normal snowpack currently across that entire region, and that's near where we expect to be the peak this season. California looking a little better. It's going to move into, oh, and sorry, I didn't update my map here. This is the USGS's, or sorry, the NRCS's way of showing this scale, and I prefer to look at it in terms of the U.S. Drought Monitor, but it's actually looking a little bit closer to normal conditions across the California region. So that was a lot. The takeaway here in terms of our snowpack is just that we're seeing really low snow conditions, and anybody can just look out their windows like I am now and think, I'm in the middle of February and I don't have snow. We haven't had snow here in Missoula that's stuck around for more than a couple hours since early December. That's pretty unreal for this region. And I know a lot of you are experiencing similar conditions where you are. What is the future looking like? Well, here's El Nino since 2000. And here's the latest projections from the Climate Prediction Center about where our our INSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation, is likely going. So we've been down in this very moderate La Nina conditions during the winter of 2025-26, and these are all of the different simulations that they're running about how our Central Pacific sea surface temperature is likely to change over the next 6 to 12 months. And what we see is that the model consensus is for us moving through the and so neutral through this middle territory where we're neither in La Nina or El Nino conditions and up into El Nino conditions by about midsummer. Here's the latest INSO probabilities, again from the NOAA Climate Prediction Center. And this is just showing you what I just showed you now, that in midwinter, we've been in La Nina conditions, that we're likely to see the emergence of neutral conditions as we move into spring and then early summer, and then followed by likely El Nino conditions as we move into midsummer and late summer. El Nino tends to have a larger impact across the Western US during our winter time. So one of the big questions will be, do we anticipate El Nino to continue into fall and winter of 2026, 2027? Only time will tell. But what we do tend to see is globally warmer temperatures during those El Nino events. And then this is what I promised earlier. There seems to be a light relationship between El Nino and La Nina events, and specifically between the transition periods and the way that we experience drought across the West. We tend to see the emergence of drought, especially in the Southern Plains, during these periods where we're going from La Nina up into El Nino conditions, where the Central Pacific is warming, and we see that as cascading aridity, abnormal aridity across the Western U.S. Here's some forecasts. This is just the next 1 to 14 days where we anticipate cooler than normal temperatures across the Western U.S. or closer to normal, and then warmer temperatures in the Eastern U.S. They're getting some relief over the next 1 to 14 days. And then our precipitation anomaly here across Colorado, the northern Great Basin, and then the Pacific Northwest and northern Rockies, we're expecting a snowstorm, or we're hoping for it to be coming in, where we're expecting some above normal precipitation over the next 2 weeks. Unfortunately, for the central Rockies, it's looking to be near normal. And as you come over into that Rio Grande and then West Texas region, much drier than normal conditions. Looking out 3 to 4 weeks, we see some warmer than normal conditions across much of the U.S., with maybe a little bit closer to normal across the Pacific Northwest. And then we see a real bifurcation in terms of our precipitation signal, of it remaining dry across the southern tier of the Western U.S., and then remaining wet and stormy here in the northern Western U.S. That generally agrees with the seasonal outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center. This is looking at February, March, April. This was issued a month ago, so they'll actually issue a new one. They may have already done it this morning. But what we see is just on average across the United States, below normal temperatures and above normal precipitation in the northern tier, and then warm and dry across the southern tier. That translates into our drought outlook. This is also produced by the Climate Prediction Center and the National Drought Mitigation Center based on the U.S. Drought Monitor. So this is just an estimate based on those predictions of what the future might look like, whether we'll see persistence, improvement, or development of drought conditions. This is through the end of February. This is a monthly product, and so what we're seeing is the expectation of persistent drought across those areas that are already experiencing it across the western U.S. And then, given those wetter than normal conditions that are expected over the next month, where they're anticipating the removal and improvement of drought conditions across some of the northern tier of the Rockies as we move through the end of April, but development of further drought in the southern Rockies and then in the southern plains. That's leading to an enhanced fire potential that we're seeing across the southern plains right now. This comes from the National Interagency Fire Center using their fire models and then bringing those into conversation with those CPC reports and looking at fuel moisture across the United States. What we're seeing is currently above normal wildland fire potential across the southern plains and actually portions of the southeast as well, and then that expanding in March. And then it's really lingering down there. We haven't hit our fire season in much of the western U.S., and so it'll be something to keep an eye on as we move into the future. Something I also like to look at is where our reservoirs are right now. So this is looking at the Missouri River Basin, the main stem of the Missouri, and those main large reservoirs here operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Fort Peck, Garrison, Owyhee, and in the entire system. And what we see is that we're sitting below normal, but that we're forecast to increase and peak due to the way that they're controlling flows out of those reservoirs at near normal conditions by August. This is looking actually better than last year, but I continue to be concerned about our snowpack situation, and I'll be interested to see if they're able to manage this type of forecasted trajectory as we move into the spring. Things are already really low in the Colorado River system, where we're seeing we're seeing Lake Powell at 26% of full pool, Lake Mead at 34% of full pool, and many of the other reservoirs very low. And so this is not good. It's not, normally we are reducing our reservoir levels during the winter time in order to anticipate a big pulse of snowpack runoff coming down that system as we move into the spring and early summer. But what we're seeing right now is that there's just not as much water up in the snowpack in the upper basin, and so I'm concerned about our reservoir levels as we move into the summer and the ability to recharge those reservoirs the way that we normally do. A lot of the California reservoirs are sitting at normal or above normal, so the conditions are a bit better there. So again, here are the key takeaways. We're seeing extreme snow drought in the western U.S. We've got areas of extreme drought as assessed via the U.S. Drought Monitor in the central Rockies, northern Great Plains, and southern plains. We're seeing us move from La Nina conditions into what are called INSO-neutral conditions that are likely to emerge as we move into the spring, and then a probability of El Nino conditions by late summer. And NOAA's Climate Prediction Center their outlooks continue to suggest persistent warm and dry conditions across the southern tier of the West. And so as we move into this spring, it's going to be essential for communities to start preparing themselves for those hydrologic impacts that we see from snow drought. What I expect to see is an expansion of those drought conditions. Our drought is not always assessed based on the snowpack conditions. It's assessed based on many different factors, convergence of evidence, but sometimes it's hard. I mean, like in the Pacific Northwest, for example, this winter in December, we saw historic precipitation, really warm storms. Some atmospheric rivers came through, but that degraded, those warm storms degraded our snowpack. It led to flooding across the Pacific Northwest, including here in Montana. And so what I like to do, and actually get a front row seat to this because several of my colleagues are part of the team in Montana that are assessing drought on a weekly basis and making recommendations to the U.S. Drought Monitor. There was an argument, a discussion about, are we in drought? We've got no snow. Our snowpack's really low, so we're experiencing snow drought. But back in December, we also were experiencing extreme precipitation. And so how does one balance those two things? Extreme precipitation, but no snowpack when making an assessment of current drought conditions. What we normally see is that drought conditions or the drought assessment in the U.S. Drought Monitor is going to lag that snowpack a bit. And once we start seeing those hydrologic impacts, then we'll really start seeing the drought assessment really building into those snow conditions. It's a complicated story, but the outcome, the upshot is clear. Prepare now for hydrologic conditions that are going to be lower than normal, low water availability for agriculture going into spring, especially for those of you who are using irrigated water. So with that, I will take your questions, but I'll also premonition that our next discussion in March, we're going to be joined by experts with the Farm Service Agency to talk about some of the programs that the Farm Service Agency has for producers that respond to drought and snow drought in particular. Things like water hauling programs, the livestock forage disaster program, and other disaster mitigation programs that can help people get through these dry times. So thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. So if anybody has any questions, you can type these in the chat if you'd like me to ask your question for you, or raise your hand. So I'm looking at the list now. I can see Maureen, you have got your hand raised. Would you like to come on camera and ask your question?
Sure.
Hey.
Hi, Kyle. If I recall, going back to your previous seasonal outlook, going into this season, we had anticipated colder than normal, wetter than normal due to La Nina patterns across our area. So if you were to compare what happened with what the forecast was, what would you say about our confidence in those seasonal forecasts? And one, and two, what happened?
So it's a really good question, Maureen. And my answer would have been dramatically different in December. So I showed those. The last time I gave one of these, I think, was at the beginning of November. And so we were looking at both monthly and seasonal outlooks. And especially the seasonal outlooks for the Climate Prediction Center are heavily weighted by those by that El Nino system in the wintertime, right? So we were seeing the emergence of La Nina. And so the prediction was the Northern Rockies would be wetter and cooler. The Southern Rockies would be warmer and drier. Now, At the new year, I would have said, well, they missed the ball on the cooler side, but boy, was the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Rockies wetter than normal. We had these large atmospheric rivers that tracked north of the Sierras and hit our communities up here, degrading snowpack, but dumping a ton of water, flooding communities, inundating them in Washington, and even here in Western Montana. So we hit the mark in terms of the northern Rockies in precipitation in December, but then things just turned off in January. Now, climatologically, it is like, especially here in the northern Rockies, it's actually sort of a drier. We get this double dip winter precipitation often, where we've got wetter beginning of winter, wetter end of winter. But I would say that those outlooks didn't hit the mark in terms of a full seasonal forecast for the northern Rockies. It's different in the Southern Rockies. This has been a pretty dry and warm winter for the Southern Rockies, and what we see is over the whole winter so far that those outlooks have really aligned with what the Climate Prediction Center was forecasting. So it's imperfect. I would say you're better off with the 1 month outlooks than the 3 month outlooks always, because it's one of the oldest problems that humanity has faced, trying to predict the weather. But I think what you can hang your hat on when you're thinking about forecasting water availability into the future is looking at snowpack that's on the ground, especially for our snow-dominated hydrographs that we have across the western U.S. And what that means is that when I'm looking out and seeing low snowpack, and what I've shown you just now, that we're seeing some historically low snowpack across the West, that is going to translate into less water coming downstream as we move into the spring.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm not seeing any hands raised or questions coming up in the chat, but folks, feel free to ask a question or think of a question while I ask my question.
Oh, great.
So, this was something that Brian over at the National Drought Mitigation Center mentioned last week. He talked about strong late season storms in March. So my question is about that. So if we were to see in the West a strong late season storm in March, or a few of those come along, and we have seen those in past years, how much could that realistically offset the current snow drought that we're seeing? And I'm asking particularly for the Rio Grande and Colorado basins.
Yeah, that's a great question, Katie, because it is true that a lot of the areas, if you look at the Rio Grande, we look at the Rio Grande in the Colorado River basins, a lot of the areas of these, especially the Rio Grande in the lower Colorado, are relatively low elevation and don't often have a ton of snowpack. They're large areas, so little snowpack adds a lot of water to the system, right? But they don't often have a ton at those lower elevations, and so a little bit could go a long way, and that's why these types of forecasts really do matter, because what this is taking into account is historically, or just at least since 2003, have we seen what sort of impact have those March storms actually produced across the Rio Grande region, when we look at the amount of water that's in the snowpack added over that entire region. Some years, this is showing the interquartile range. So that means that this is like the 75th percentile of where snowpack could be going. And so there have been years where we've seen a big increase during March down in the Rio Grande. But there have also been years where we've seen persistent decreases. This is the 25th percentile down here, and then the median. This is normal, right? Normal between those two, the 50th percentile, is that we don't expect normally these storms aren't actually adding a ton to that aggregated snowpack across the entire region. The same thing can be said across the upper and lower Colorado regions. Here's the upper Colorado, where yeah, we do expect that there to be some additional accumulation, but since 2003, we haven't seen a lot of those storms. And this is just a bare bones statistical assessment that's treating all years equally. What this isn't doing is saying, well, when we are having years with low snowpack, do we often have persistent low snowpack? Are we going to stay more down here than up towards the median or up in the 75th percentile? And that's a good question, right? Is past prologue when it comes to our snowpack? I don't have an answer for that right now, but what I do know is that generally these from this point on, we've got a pretty good handle of where our snowpack is likely to be. And sorry, I keep looking this way away from my camera. This is where your head is. But for the Colorado River Basin, for example, the median accumulation through the rest of the season based on those previous years is gonna still have us be at a record low snowpack for this season.
So in short, we can hope, but it's not going to make a whole lot of difference.
In short, we can hope, but we want to hope to be way up here or even higher, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the shorter term outlooks, those 2-week to 4-week outlooks, continue to suggest persistent dry, warm conditions across the southern Rockies and southern plains. So at least out the next month, we're not expecting to see that sort of relief for the southern Rockies and southern plains. We are expecting to see a continued active pattern, as they say in the weather prediction, a continued active pattern across the Pacific Northwest and the northern Rockies, and that may indeed be impactful for us.
Thanks, Kyle.
Yeah.
A question did come up in the chat, and Dirk asks this, and he asks it to everybody, but I'm asking it to you too in case you have some input. Dirk asked if snowpack that has been our historic storage for agriculture and potable water is disappearing, are there other initiatives for increasing other means, or are there any initiatives rather for increasing other means of storage? Just letting you know, Holly posted capturing rain and shared on the Native Resilience rainwater harvesting link. And
that's a great. The rainwater harvesting is a great project that one of our graduate students, as part of the Native Resilience in a previous project, Native Waters on Arid Lands, did her master's thesis on rainwater harvesting. Yes, there are programs that are designed to educate you on what you can do to store water for local domestic use, to store water for agricultural use. At the larger basin scale, we just have our standard tools. Reservoir management is a big one, and I'm sure our managers across the Army Corps of Engineers, across the Bureau of Reclamation and Department of Energy are really looking at that reservoir storage and trying to maximize that storage capacity as we're moving into what's going to be a dry summer. And then the other part that's not reflected on here, a lot of our regions are somewhat dependent on groundwater. And so groundwater recharge, we're not going to get a lot of recharge from this year with a low snowpack, but that sometimes occurs on much larger time scales. And so looking at groundwater resources and where those are at can be really helpful. I don't have any good answers for you though about other initiatives that are going on, and I welcome anybody in here to share their thoughts as Holly did.
There's also the managed aquifer recharge programs, which is capturing rain and runoff and then putting them in, accessible aquifers. But that has complications with who owns the water when, and if it's for agricultural purposes, to do that in the wintertime when it's not ag water.
Yes. I want to acknowledge that we have come to the top of the hour, so please don't hesitate to sign off. Please do register for our next webinar, which will be in exactly 1 month on March 17th, where we will be joined with leadership in the Farm Service Agency's tribal programs to talk about some of the relief programs that exist that may help with some of our snow drought impacts. Until then, I'm always available on email if you've got any questions, and then I'm happy to stick around if people have lingering questions right now.